In this lecture, we will introduce several types of selection statements. As we've said before, what makes Boolean variables very useful is that we can alter the execution flow. So we can decide which portions of our code we're going to run and what portions of our code we're going to skip. And there are three different types of selection or branch control structures. We have the if statement, the if-else statement, and the switch structure. Now for this lecture, we're only going to focus on the first two. We'll get to switches later on, don't worry. We'll first take a look at one-way selection, which is to say we can go one direction with our code or a different direction. So to do this, we use an if statement to determine if we want to execute a part of the program or we just want to skip it. So here's the format of this if statement. We would have if and then some condition in the parentheses, and then immediately below it, we would have some statement. So what does this all mean? If the condition in our parentheses is true, so if it evaluates the true, then we would execute the true statement below in our if statement in this case. And if our condition is not true, or if it's false, then we just simply skip the statement. So here we're just deciding if our condition is true, execute the line where here it corresponds to the true statement. If our condition is false, we skip it and we just move on with the rest of our program. And notice that the true statement part, which is also called an action statement, which we don't use that term a lot, but that is what it's called, is indented. You're not required to indent the line. I mean, you're not going to get a compile error, but this is another one of those style formatting rules that we highly recommend to make it easier to understand the code. So let's take a look at a couple of examples to help illustrate the if statement. So let's say we want to determine a letter grade. So maybe we have some variable called score, which has the score for an exam, a homework assignment, and then we have a variable called grade, which stores the letter grade. So here we're saying if score is greater than or equal to 90, then we're going to store a capital A in grade. Now if the score is not greater than or equal to 90, so if it's less than 90, then we're just going to skip that. We're not going to set the grade to A. Maybe we'll set it to something else. Another example is that maybe we want to compute the absolute value of a number. Well, how do we do that? Well, we first see if our number is negative, so if it's less than 0, then we want to get the negation of that. So like, for example, if our number is -5, we would want it to become +5. And the way we do that is just simply negate the value of our variable. So the negation of -5 is going to be +5. Now, if our number is already greater than or equal to 0, we don't want to get the negation of it, so we're just going to skip the line num equals -num. You may have also noticed that there was not a semicolon after the parentheses of our if statement. So in one of our earlier examples, we didn't have if score is greater than or equal to 90 with a semicolon. Remember that the purpose of the semicolon is to say that we're at the end of the statement, which means if we include our semicolon there, that would mean that our if statement would terminate right at that point. So what that means is, well, a couple things. It means that our true portion, so our true statement, would happen regardless of whether the condition is true or false. So if we want to skip over that line of code in some circumstances, including the semicolon there would not let that happen. So it's the same thing as saying if score is greater than or equal to 90, just don't do anything special. Just keep resuming your code. So be very careful with that we do not want to include semicolons at the end of the if statement itself. Now, in our previous approach, we were limited with which portions of code we run. It's either we execute the line of code or we don't execute it. And there are several situations where we may want to choose between two alternatives. So maybe if our condition is true, we may want to do something. If our condition is false, maybe not only do we want to skip that portion of the code, but maybe we want to do something very specific instead. So the way we go about this is we can add a little bit more to our if statement if our condition is false. And this is what we call an if-else statement. So it's if something is true, we do something, else we do something else. So let's take a look at the format of our if-else statement. So we have if, then some condition, then some true statement, and then else, and then a false statement. So the first part of this is the same as before. So if the condition is true, we do the true statement. If it's false, we do something, we don't do that if that true statement. But now we use the keyword else to handle the false portion of our statement. So what this is saying is we either execute the true statement or the false statement, but we cannot execute both. We can only execute one or the other, depending on whether our condition is true or false. So let's take a look at an example of an if-else statement. So let's say we have something like this. If x is less than 10, then y equals x. Otherwise, or else, y equals x plus 5. So this is saying that if x is less than 10, then we're going to execute the statement y equals x. If x is not less than 10, then we're going to execute the statement y equals x plus 5. Now in this case, it's actually important to make sure that we do not place a semicolon after the parentheses. Beforehand, we wouldn't get any errors, it's just that we would run lines of code that we necessarily would not want to run. Now this would give us an error if we include the semicolon. And this is because the else statement is no longer part of the if statement. So it's really important that if you have an else statement, there must be a matching if statement. So in other words, the else part cannot exist without the corresponding if statement. Here is another example of a common error that students have when writing an if statement. So this is saying if score is greater than equal to 60, you have system.out.println you pass. Now what most people would think is if that's not true, then we would print out system.out.println you fail, which is true. I mean, if it is greater than equal to 60, you should print you pass, and if it's not greater than equal to 60, you should print out you fail. The problem with this line though is that the second statement is going to happen no matter what. Since we don't have that else, it's going to happen no matter what. So even if the score is greater than equal to 60, we're going to print out you pass, but we're going to print the next line. This is because the way the if statement works is whatever comes immediately after the if statement is what executes, and it's only one line. We'll talk about in just a second on how we fix that, but the way this is currently set up is if our condition is true, we execute the immediate next line and then we resume execution. So printing you fail is going to happen no matter whether our condition is true or false. So how do we fix that? What if we want to run multiple statements if a particular condition is true or false? Well, we can use a compound statement or a block. The way we do this is just we include a pair of curly braces. So the format for that is just something like this, where we have our pair of curly braces and we just have however many statements we want in here. So we have statement 1, statement 2, all the way down to statement n. This is kind of similar to our methods, where we would have the name of our method and then we have a pair of curly braces, or our class. We have our name of our class and a pair of curly braces. Here we just have a pair of curly braces and then we just put whatever code we want in here. So what this means is we can use a compound statement in place of a single statement whenever we're doing an if statement or an if-else statement. So let's take a look at an example. Let's say I have if score greater than or equal to 90. And then notice I have my compound statement where grade is set to capital A, and then we have system.out.println you get an A. So both of these lines will run if our condition is true. Now if our condition is false, the entire compound statement, that entire block of code gets skipped, and we just execute what comes immediately after the else part. So system.out.println you did not get an A.